to this campground in North Carolina. Beck putters off in her little golf cart before I can ask her all my questions. Harriet and I stand there on the path for a moment, marveling at the icon of Thurman in my hands. I know a bit about the folklore surrounding the Wild Goose Festival, the talk that a holy coincidence could happen at any moment. In Celtic spirituality, geese represent the Holy Spirit, and I find that in my experience as a spiritual director and companion, Spirit orchestrates events without warning. Even with that awareness, I remain incredulous. Is this a coincidence? Or is this some manifestation of the spirit of Howard Thurman? If the latter, what does he want? I look more closely at the painting of St. Howard Thurman, initialed by Beck. I still can't fathom why Beck painted this portrait, or why we happened to cross paths that morning. Harriet and I shake our heads and smile. Then we walk together toward my next event about Thurman, under the broad canopy of trees. Discovering Howard Thurman. 7 years earlier, I was searching for a final project to fulfill the requirements for my spiritual direction and companioning training program. My frustration was growing. I wanted to research and write about a holy person, someone I could get to know, whose work spoke to my soul and whose spiritual evolution I could observe. But no one whose work I had read thus far excited me. The mystics we were reading lived hundreds of years ago, primarily in Europe, although there was a passing reference to an Asian Buddhist or Sufi poet. Each one lived in a religious community, often in a monastery or convent, isolated from the neighborhoods and daily routines I was familiar with. I wondered if becoming a monk or nun was the only way to commune with God and live a holy life. My interest in spirituality had begun many years ago during college. Over the years, I read Catholic mystics like St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, dabbled in Thomas Merton, studied Quaker mystics George Fox, Thomas Kelly, and John Woolman, and Sufi mystics Rabia Rumi and Hafiz, and enjoyed the work of Henri Nouwen. Having perused the writings of dozens of spiritual teachers, I remained especially curious about ordinary mystics, as Marcia Sinitar refers to them. Ordinary mystics are regular people who sense the presence of God, hear a guiding voice, or have a transcendent experience of oneness. Mysticism, writes Father Albert Haas, means living with a sensitivity to the divine presence and responding to God's ardent longing and enthusiastic invitation to a deeper relationship at this very moment. In a burning bush, as happened to Moses, in the tiny whisper of a sound, as Elijah experienced, in the call out of hiding, like Zacchaeus. In whatever manner an experience of God occurs, a radical inner transformation frequently accompanies it. This shift may include becoming less self-centered and more focused on God, other people, and the larger world. Sometimes I wondered whether I might be an ordinary mystic, and perhaps you do too. Do mystics sometimes live outside of religious communities, practicing contemplation in the middle of normal life? And what about African or African American mystics? They must exist somewhere in the history of the world, I thought. So why hadn't I encountered any Black contemplatives in my studies? Why was I often the only Black person in the room at spiritual direction trainings and workshops or on silent retreats? I prayed to Spirit to direct me to a wisdom teacher in whom I could see my psychological, racial, and spiritual reality reflected. When I shared my concerns with an African American clergy friend and pastoral counselor, Joshua, he looked at me in disbelief. "You mean you haven't heard of Howard Thurman?" he asked. "He is an American treasure." No, I had never heard of him. Why wasn't his name mentioned when people spoke about Christian mystics, even contemporary ones like Thomas Merton or Mother Teresa? Joshua recommended a few Thurman books for me to read. When I opened the pages of Meditations of the Heart, and later, With Head and Heart, the autobiography of Howard Thurman, I felt an immediate sense of spiritual kinship. Then, as I delved more deeply into Howard Thurman and his work, I was overcome with shock.